Evaluating Personality Theories. Chapter 1 of Personality Theories is the name of the book. So, Chapter 1, Introduction to Evaluating Personality Theories. Defining the word personality would be a good way to begin a book that considers various theories of personality. However, writing a definition is not that simple. The different answers that people have given to the question has found expression throughout history in various cultural constructs, such as philosophy, religion, art, politics, and science. Each one of us begins the search anew. As children seeking identity, and later as adults reflecting upon our identity, we wonder who we are and join fellow travelers on the road in search for self. What is personality? In common speech, the term personality usually refers to someone's image. Thus, people say, Becky has a terrific personality, or if only Jeff had a more dynamic personality. This common usage reflects the origin of the word personality. In Latin, personae, which referred to the masks that actors wore in ancient Greek plays. In the Greek theater, there were often more roles in a play than there were actors. Thus, actors changed personae to let the audience know that they were assuming different roles. And the concept of social roles, however, does not include the complications that are involved in the long search to understand the self. There is little common agreement among personality theorists on appropriate use of the term personality. Gordon Allport described and classified over 50 different definitions. For Allport, personality was something real within the individual that leads to characteristic behavior and thought. For Carl Rogers, the personality, or self, is an organized, consistent pattern of perception of the I, or me, that lies in the heart of the individual's experiences. For B.F. Skinner, an influential behaviorist, the word personality was unnecessary. Skinner did not believe that it was necessary or desirable to use the concept of the self or personality to understand human behavior. For Sigmund Freud, the father of contemporary psychoanalysis, personality is largely unconscious, hidden, and unknown. Each theorist presents us with his or her own understanding of the term personality. In part, this helps to explain why there are so many different personality theories. Although such a variety of definitions and theories may be confusing and even disturbing, it does not mean that the theories are not useful. Each offers insight into the question of the self, and each can be helpful to us as we develop our own answers. So what is a theory? Since we are referring to theories of personality, the next question is, what is a theory? Here you may be pleased to see that there is a more definitive answer. The term theory comes from the Greek word theora, which refers to the act of viewing, contemplating, or thinking about something. A theory is a set of abstract concepts developed about a group of facts or events in order to explain them. A theory of personality, therefore, is an organized system of beliefs that help us understand human nature. Describing theory as a system of beliefs underscores the fact that a theory is something that we can create in the process of viewing and thinking about our world. Theories are not given or necessitated by nature. Rather, they are constructed by people in their efforts to understand the world. The same data or experiences can be accounted for in many different ways, and people of all cultures are interested in and have engaged in the scholarly effort to understand themselves, constructing a wide variety of explanations. As we shall see, there will be many theories of personality. Historically, a Western focus has dominated the formal discussion on theories of personality, but efforts are being made to attend to other perspectives, such as Asian and Afrocentric. So what is personality? It is an organized, consistent pattern of perception of the I, or me, that lies at the heart of an individual's experiences. Let's see, we've got some pictures of some peoples. All right, role of personality theory in psychology. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one. Figure 1.1, the many views of personality. Personality is not readily defined concept. Shown here are just some of the views of personality held by different personality theorists. As you proceed through the text to examine the work of the individual personality theorists, you will discover many more different views of personality. And it gives Gordon Allport is something real, explains his as it is something real within an individual that leads to characteristic behavior and thought. We have B.F. Skinner, thinks it's an unnecessary construct. And then we got one over there. I think the page cuts off for me. I'm using a digital. Anyways, carrying on. The role of personality theory in psychology. Because personality addresses the questions of who am I, you might imagine that personality is the primary emphasis of psychology. In fact, personality is not the dominant concern in contemporary psychology. It is simply one area of specialization. The question, what is personality, takes us back to early human history, as psychology found its expression in the early philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. It sought to clarify the essence of the human being and explore what it means to be a person. By the late 19th century, the scientific revolution had made great strides in comprehending the physical world, and people were eager to apply scientific methods to the study of human beings. Modern-day psychology emerged from a combination of various movements in philosophy and science. And in 1879, Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920, established the first psychological laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Germany to explore the experience of consciousness. By combining careful measurement with introspective observation and self-examination, Wundt sought to reveal the basic elements and structures of the conscious mind. Wundt was successful in establishing a meticulous systematic method of study based on the experimental method. However, his emphasis on conscious experience was criticized in the 1920s by John Watson, 1879 to 1958, who came to be known as the father of American behaviorism. Watson pointed out that it is almost impossible to observe mental processes directly. Therefore, he suggested that the psychologist should act as if mental processes do not exist and should concentrate on overt behavior. Although few psychologists today agree with Watson's extreme view, the brain scanning equipment depict the brain in action. The behaviorist position that Watson generated became the dominant movement in American psychology throughout most of the 20th century. Watson was succeeded as a leader in the movement by B.F. Skinner, who took the behaviorist position to the logical extreme. Because of Skinner's influence, students of psychology rapidly discovered that, for the most part, they were engaged not in the study of the person, but in the study of behavior, usually on rats and pigeons. They were encouraged to adopt a rigorous scientific methodology that emphasized extrospective observations, but looking towards B.F. Skinner's theory, as discussed in greater detail in this chapter, the experimental analysis of behavior. So today, psychologists are very interested in the brain and the mental processes shunned by Watson and Skinner. Cognitive psychology emphasizes how people receive, process, and react to information from their environment. On the other hand, psychology has retained from the behaviorists an emphasis on rigorous methodology, emphasizing extrospective observation. Not all of the personality theorists that we will consider agree that a rigorous scientific method is the best way to understand personality. In fact, the first theories of personality developed outside the mainstream of academic experimental psychology. While Wundt was at work in his laboratory at Leipzig, Sigmund Freud, 1859 to 1939, who was not a psychologist but rather a neurologist and a physician in private practice in Vienna, was employing introspection somewhat differently in his treatment of patients who were suffering from emotional problems. Instead of using introspection only to examine present phenomena, Freud had also taught his patients to employ retrospectively to examine past experiences. Thus, Freud was able to examine phenomena that could not be elicited in a laboratory. Freud found introspection to be a valuable tool for discovering and exploring unconscious processes. On the basis of his clinical observations, Freud developed a theory of personality discussed in the chapter on psychoanalysis. Freud's methods was far different from the experimental laboratory research that characterizes most of psychology today. Some of Freud's followers became dissatisfied with orthodox psychoanalysis and founded their own schools of thought. Although these theorists were all deeply indebted to Freud, they reacted in varying ways against his theory and developed their own positions. The study of personality became a formal and systematic area of scientific specialization in American psychology in the mid-1930s, and it is most often considered to fit somewhere between social and clinical psychology. Some psychologists have recommended that all research in personality be conducted and evaluated along a strict scientific guidelines as defined by the mainstream academic psychology. The study of personality is heir to two different approaches, academic psychology and clinical practice. See figure 1.2, which have really never been merged. Examples of each are found in the theories discussed in this book. So it is also helpful to distinguish between macro theories of personality, which seek to be global, which emphasize comprehension of the whole person, and the macro theories and the micro theories, which have resulted from specific research focused on limited aspects of human behavior. Some of the micro studies can be very narrowly focused. For example, one study explores how a specific scientific model of personality might clarify impulsiveness. Courses of personality theorists tend to emphasize macro theories, and courses in personality research favor the topical micro approach. In general, but by no means entirely, macro theories are more likely to stem from the tradition of clinical observations, whereas micro theories reflect academic psychology. A review of the brief contents at the beginning of this book will give you a good overview of the theories we're going to consider, most of which would be considered macro theories. We will begin with the theory of Sigmund Freud and then cover some of his early followers, as well as contemporary theorists who continue the tradition of psychoanalytic thought that Freud initiated. Next, we will turn to a group of theorists who emphasize the role of learning in development in human behavior. B.F. Skinner is the most recognized among these behavior and learning theorists. We also will look at a number of other approaches to the study of personality. Gordon Allport, for example, is one of several dispositional theorists who emphasize the importance of long-term characteristics in personality. Research in the area today encompasses biology and genetics. We will discuss humanist and existential theorists, which stress the tendency of the human personality towards growth, and cognitive theories, which focus on how people process information about themselves and their world. Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow are two representatives of the humanist approach, and George Kelly and Albert Ellis reflect the cognitive approach. We will round out our presentation of personality theories with a recognition of the growing importance of non-Western approaches and an in-depth look at Zen Buddhism. A table at the very back of the book summarizes the theorists discussed here. And so, the evaluation of personality theory. Personality theories work out three contemporary orientations: philosophy, science, and art. Theories of personality are not just armchair speculations, but belief systems that find expression in ways that are designed to help us understand and improve ourselves and the world. The art of personality theory, or its expression in practical application, is much older than the science or even the philosophy behind it. From earliest times, much have been spoken and written about how to live a good life and to understand one another as people have practiced ways of understanding themselves and living together. Before the study of personality became a specialization of academic scientific psychology, questions of personality and the good life were generally included under the broader umbrella of philosophy. Even today, many personality theorists resemble philosophical investigations rather than scientific studies. As the science of personality theory investigations governed by appropriate rules have developed, it has provided us with new knowledge, tools, and methods of self-understanding and improvement. Science further demands the scientific theory be empirically validated or ultimately based on the sensory experience. However, the specific mode of study and investigation characteristic in the modern personality scientist arises out of prior philosophical encounter with the world. Science is an offspring of philosophy, and its methods are the fruit of the philosophy's labors. The methods of art, science, and philosophy are distinguishable but not unrelated. They complement one another and together provide us a fuller understanding. Philosophy, science, and art may be seen as three complementary orientations from which personality theorists work. As philosophers, personality theorists seek to explore assumptions about what it means to be a person. As scientists, they hope to develop a workable set of hypotheses to help us understand human behavior. And as artists, they seek to apply what is known about people and behavior to foster a better life. Each activity is conducted according to certain rules with its own criteria for success. The metaphor of games is used here because even young school children know that we want to play a game properly and fairly. We have to understand its rules and to follow them. Each activity that personality theorists engage in as philosophers, scientists, and artists may be seen as a distinct game to be conducted according to certain rules with its own methods of play and criteria for success. According to potential athletes need to become familiar with the rules, equipment, and scoring of their sport. So students of personality theory need to become familiar with the rules that govern how these three distinct facets of personality theory, philosophy, science, and art, work. You'll have difficulty understanding a personality theorist unless you can identify the particular activity or approach that theorist is engaged in and know how to evaluate it. Philosophical assumptions. No psychologist or personality theorist can avoid being a philosopher of sorts. All sciences, and particularly the hyper-complex social sciences, are influenced by philosophy. The very act of theorizing and thinking about what we see, which all people, not only personality theorists, do, entails making certain philosophical assumptions about the world and human nature. These basic philosophical assumptions profoundly influence the way in which we perceive the world and theorize about it. The term philosophy comes from the Greek word philin and Sophia. I feel like that's spelled wrong. Okay. To love and wisdom. The love of wisdom, right? It means the love or pursuit of wisdom. Wisdom denotes not merely knowing what something about something, but knowing what ought to be done and how to do it. As philosophers, we make assumptions and judgments about the good life and how to live it. Okay, so just as potential athletes need to become familiar with the rules, equipment, and scoring of whatever sport they wish to engage in, students of personality theory need to become familiar with the different rules governing personality theories to avoid getting into trouble. Very few of us have complete and articulate philosophies of life, but our thoughts, statements, and theorizing are informed by our philosophical assumptions. In the same sense, very few, if any, of the personality theorists whom we will consider aim at developing complete philosophical pictures of ourselves and the world. Most consider themselves psychologists rather than philosophers. Nevertheless, in their psychologizing, they rise philosophical issues and in doing so reflect philosophical assumptions. Basic philosophical assumptions. Many of the differences among personality theorists can be attributed to the fundamental differences in philosophical assumptions. Some of the common issues about which the personality theorists disagree are described below. Each issue is presented here as a bipolar dimension. Some theorists agree with one and the other, or the other. Others are neutral towards the issue and seek synthesis. Freedom versus determination. Some theorists believe that individuals basically have control over their behaviors and understand the motives behind them. Others believe that human behavior is basically determined by internal or external forces over which an individual have little, if any, control. Heredity versus environment. Theorists differ over whether I think that's cut off there. Inherited or inborn characteristics of factors in the environment have more important influence on human behavior. Uniqueness versus universality. Universality? Yeah. Some theorists believe that each individual is unique and cannot be compared with others. Others contend that people are basically very similar. Proactivity versus reactivity. Proactive theorists view human beings as acting. Oh my gosh, where's the page going here? Okay, that's the whole part. Okay. Yeah. Optimism versus pessimism. Do significant changes in personality or behavior occur throughout the course of a lifetime? If an individual is motivated, can genuine changes be affected in personality? Can we help others to change and restructuring their environment? Some personality theories are decidedly more optimistic and hopeful than others concerning these possibilities. Where do you stand on these issues? See Philosophical Assumptions box examining your own philosophical assumptions on page 10 on the initiative rather than simply reacting with the sources of behavior are perceived as lying within the individual. Who does more than just react to stimuli of the outside world? Philosophical assumptions may be explicit or implicit. Oh, next section is called Distinguishing Philosophical Assumptions from Scientific Statements. All right, so philosophical assumptions may be explicit or implicit. It is often difficult to identify a person's assumptions when they are implicit and not stated clearly. You'll find it easier to recognize philosophical assumptions if you understand that philosophy frequently posits a distinction between what is and what ought to be. Philosophical statements suggest that things are not necessarily what they appear to be. What is not necessarily what should be or what really is. For instance, the fact that many people are aggressive does not necessarily mean that aggression is right or that aggression represents what it means to be a human. Philosophical knowledge is ultimately an epiphany from the Greek word epiphania, which means appearance or manifestation. Cool. Or perception of essential meaning. The seeing of philosophy is a special act of knowing, an extraordinary intuition that transcends every experience. Philosophical assumptions therefore differ from empirical statements, which are based on ordinary observations. The statement, all people seek what is good, for example, does not refer to something that can be seen in everyday observation. It refers to some kind of ultimate reality that is perceived in a different way. We say that this statement is based on epiphanetic evidence. Scientific statements, too, often refer to things that we cannot see in ordinary observation. Many important constructs of science involve imagery concepts that cannot be seen. However, even these scientific statements are are ultimately, even if indirectly, based on empirical observation, and the methods used to test them differ from the methods of philosophy. So how do scientific statements and philosophical assumptions differ? The difference lies in the nature of the observation that gives rise to the construct in the way in which it is tested. Karl Popper, 1902-94, a philosopher of science, clarified for us that the scientific statements must be open to falsification. Said that in 1963. Science is required to indicate the conditions under which its statements might be proven incorrect. When an exception is found to a scientific generalization, that generalization must be qualified. In contrast, philosophical assumptions are not tentative hypotheses to be discarded when evidence contradicts them. There is no way to construct an empirical test that would let us falsify the philosophical assumption. If I maintain the philosophy that all people seek what is good, I will not permit any ordinary observations to disprove the assumption. On the contrary, I can account for all exceptions and seemingly contradictions in terms of my assumption itself. The easiest way to recognize whether a scientific declaration of a theory function as scientific statements or philosophical assumptions is to ask what evidence would lead the theorist to change his or her position. If empirical evidence does not lead to a revision in the theory, you can be pretty sure that the declaration functions as a philosophical assumption. The personality theories described in this book represent philosophical points of view as well as scientific investigations. Some of these theories are explicitly philosophical. In others, the philosophical assumptions are not clearly stated, but they are nevertheless present. Carl Rogers openly acknowledged that his view of the self was philosophical and that his primary differences with other theorists, such as B.F. Skinner, were philosophical ones. Sigmund Freud initially conceived of his work as lacking any philosophy, but finally admitted that many of his assumptions function philosophically. Because personality theories and our own thoughts involve philosophical assumptions, it is important that we recognize and evaluate them as such. Criteria for evaluating philosophical assumptions. Scientific statements are proven false by the process of perceptual observation. In contrast, philosophical assumptions have criteria that are suitable for the epiphanic vision that underlies them. But we cannot set up a crucial test or experiment that will determine whether or not the vision is justified. Philosophical assumptions have their own criteria or tests. Here are 3 criteria for evaluating the philosophical assumptions that underlie personality theories. There are 3 criteria add up to a 4th and final criteria of compellingness. The first criteria is coherence. Are the philosophical assumptions of personality theory clear, logical, and consistent, or are they riddled with contradictions and inconsistencies? The philosophical system may have apparent inconsistencies, perplexing metaphors, or paradoxes, and still be coherent, provided that the contradictions are ironed out within the philosophical stance itself, so that the final position represents a clear, coherent whole. A person's philosophical system may also be unfinished, that is, open to further growth, but to be coherent, it must have a clearly recognizable, consistent thrust. Okay, the second criterion is relevance. To be meaningful, a philosophical assumption must have some bearing on our view of reality. If we do not share the philosophical view of reality, we will have considerable difficulty judging the assumption. In our postmodern world, the criterion of relevance further implies that the assumption is compatible with empirical reality as best we can ascertain it. Thus, philosophies are invariably reshaped by scientific discoveries. For example, people's current assumptions regarding the impact of heredity versus environment have been influenced by recent scientific findings in genetics. The third criterion, comprehensiveness. Is the philosophical assumption deep enough? In part, the question refers to scope. Does the assumption cover what it intends to cover? Further, the criterion of comprehensiveness asks whether the treatment of a subject is profound or superficial. A philosophical assumption, a philosophical assumption is superficial if it leaves out too many questions, if it leaves too many questions unanswered, or if it refuses to address them. These three criteria lead to a fourth criterion, compellingness. The final and most important question is, does the assumption and its underlying philosophy convince you? A philosophical assumption convinces you if it grabs you in such a way that you find the belief inescapable. It is as if you have to believe in it. Actually, it is perfectly possible that a philosophical assumption may strike you as being coherent, relevant, and comprehensive. But in spite of those features, it does not compel you to believe it. In such a case, the belief does not have to move you, and you can. In such a case, the belief does not move you, and you cannot buy it. My language here deliberately describes you as passive. The philosophical assumption grabs you. You are compelled. The language underscores the fact that philosophical assumptions are not merely subjective opinions that the person has about the world. Rather, they emerge you out of the person's encounter with the world. They entail an active meeting of the person and the world that leads to a position about reality that the person finds inescapable. A way in which philosophers create their views of the world is similar to, although more formal than, a manner in which each one of us comes up with our own view. We may not have thought as much or written about, but each one of us, upon reflection, can probably think of a significant incident or period in our lives when we experienced. Is that the end? Oh, no, here we go. Deliberate. Nope. Sorry, it's kind of laid out sort of funny, and I try to navigate here. Does it pick back up? Where are we at here? Here we go. Illness or incident. An individual also perceives life as having a new mission or purpose that is not present before. Such experiences constitute the formative insights that shape our lives. During the second half of the 20th century, we moved from a modern view of the world to a postmodern view that no one has monopoly on. Truth, and that knowledge, is a matter of perspective. This is not to say that there is no truth about all perspectives are equally valuable. Most of our reconstructions of the past reveal something that led us to think about ourselves and our world in a different way. For example, after a where does it go from here? I'm assuming. Okay, for example, after a deliberate ethnocentric Western view of personhood, postmodernism rises a specific. I'm lost. Postmodernist rises a special challenge as we move to develop more globally relevant, multiculturally sensitive explanations appropriate for the 21st century. I'm going to go ahead and guess that that's where that goes. So we're going to hit one more little section. Sorry, it got hairy. Okay, so this is examining your own philosophical assumptions. By looking at your own philosophical assumptions, you can better prepare yourself to recognize them in the theories of others. In Table 1.1, each basic issue is presented as a bipolar dimension along which a person's view can be placed according to the degree or agreement with one or the other extreme. You can rate your own view on a scale of 1 to 5. Each issue, if you completely agree with the first statement, rate the issue with the number 1. If you completely agree with the second statement, raise the issue with the number 5. If you only moderately agree with either statement, a number 2 or 4 would best reflect your view. If you are neutral towards the issue and believe that the best person is a synthesis of the two extremes, rate with a number 3. The first time you go through these items, rate each issue according to your beliefs. The second time, consider each issue in terms of your actions, the ways in which you generally behave. When you have determined where you stand on each of these major issues, a comparison of your positions can help you assess the importance of these issues in your own understanding of personality. Those assumptions that you feel very strongly about, mark with a 1 or a 5, probably play a very important role in your personal philosophy. If you are not strongly committed to any particular sense, that issue is probably not as important as your thinking about personality. You should note that even experts differ in their responses to the statement in Table 1.1. Each different personality theorists that we shall discuss vary markedly in their position on which each of these issues. Each adopts a position that appears most commendable or compelling. Throughout the text, you'll be asked to return to these assumptions, to consider the stance of specific theorists, and see how your attitudes towards certain theorists are related to your own stance on these 5 dimensions. All right, so hard to read this grid. Moving along. All right. I have to return to that when I get my book in hand. All right. So, scientific statements. Yes. All right. As scientists, personality theorists seek to develop a workable set of hypotheses or orientative assumptions that will help us understand human behavior. Scientists confirm their hypotheses by testing them according to the generally agreed upon methods. The science, which comes from the Latin word, I cannot see what that word says. I think it's a sire, to know, is a group of methods of acquiring knowledge that are based on certain principles. The philosophical basis of science. Science has its origin in philosophy, and as such, it retains its elements of its forebears. Thomas Kuhn, 1922 to 1996, a physicist who studied the history of science, points out that he reminds us that the observation on which scientific activity based is not a fixed one, and for all by the nature of the world are sensory apparatus, but depends on a prior paradigm. A paradigm is a model or concept of the world that is shared by the members of the community and that governs their activities. Everyday observation and perception are shaped through education and are subjective to change over time. Your view of the world, for example, is very different from that of a person in ancient Greece or a member of an isolated primitive tribe. Indeed, without some sort of paradigm, we should not draw any conclusions from our observations at all. Scientific statements, therefore, are statements about the world based on empirical observations arising from currently accepted paradigms, which should also be seen as shared philosophical assumptions. The paradigms are not derived from scientific activity, but exist prior to it. For example, the scientific viewpoint that one should base conclusions on perceptions that can be shared by others rather than on private, intrinsically unique perceptions is a value statement that is not mandated by our observations, but chosen by the community of scientists as more useful. It is a paradigm. Here, here. All right, recognizing scientific statements. The keystone of science is empirical observation. Okay, and the simplest kinds of statements in science are empirical statements, such as there is a person in the room. To know whether or not an empirical statement is valid, an individual has to be shown evidence based on sensory data regarding what has been seen, heard, felt, smelt, or tasted. Empirical statements have been based on objective data or subjective data. If someone reports, "I see a person," we can interpret that statement in 2 ways. The person may be saying, "I see a person," or "I see a person." In the first case, we're referring to the object of experience, or objective data. In the second, we're referring to an experience of seeing, or subjective data. Both objective and subjective knowledge refer to empirical data. The difference between them lies in the position of the observer. In objective knowledge, the person is I, it, the self looking outward on the world as object. In subjective knowledge, the person is I, me, the self looking inward on its own experience as the object. Reports are concerned with the object of experience, or extrospective data, are relatively simple to verify. We merely indicate the conditions under which the observation may be repeated. If the second observer does not see the reported phenomena, we suggest that the conditions are not clearly specified. For example, the observer looked for a person in the wrong room, or may suspect that the original observer has a distorted sense of perception. Repeated observations of the same phenomena under specified conditions lead to a consensual validation or agreement among observers. Reports are concerned with introspective or subjective phenomena are much more difficult to validate consensually. A certain piece of art may give one person much joy but fail to move someone else. This is because subjective phenomena occurs under complex conditions and are more difficult to describe than objective information. Repeating such subjective observations may require a second observer to undergo extensive training or other experiences in order to duplicate all of the conditions. Undoubtedly, one's joy on seeing a particular piece of art depends not simply on the art itself, but also on one's culture, mood, personal history, and so forth. Considerable effort is needed to duplicate these observations, but it is not impossible. Since reports are concerned with subjective phenomena, they are much more difficult to validate. Some psychologists have tended to ignore them, investing their efforts in extrospective or objective feelings. As we saw, John Watson recommended that inasmuch of our thoughts, feelings, and wishes cannot be directly observed by another person, the psychologist should ignore them and concentrate on overt behaviors. Few psychologists today would agree with this extreme position. Most personality theorists emphasize that we need to be concerned with both subjective and objective data in order to understand behavior. When a number of different instances of observation coincide, the scientists may make a generalization, a scientific or empirical generalization. It is a conclusion that something is true about many of all of the members of a certain class. Suppose I wanted to test a statement. All aggressive people are controlling. The evidence for this statement could be a number of facts about individual members of the class. I could observe this aggressive person, that aggressive person, and other aggressive persons. If all of them were also controlling, I might conclude that all aggressive people are controlling, even though I have not examined each and every aggressive person. Because it is impossible for me to explain each and every aggressive person who has ever existed in the past or might exist in the present or future, I can never know for certain that my empirical generalization is true. Indeed, misleading stereotypes are often the result of premature or unwise generalizations. As a scientist and a personality theorist must leave empirical generalizations open to possible falsification. The scientist that uses definitions, statements, and that are true because of the way in which we have agreed to use the words, some words are easy to define clearly and precisely. Other words are harder to define and subject to more disagreement. To resolve this problem, the social scientist frequently tries to develop operational definitions. An operational definition specifies behaviors. Lost my spot. An operational definition specifies which behaviors are included in the concept. Stress might be operationally defined term of the rate of one's heartbeat. and the extent of one's perspiration, also measured by polygraph apparatus, which translate such bodily changes into printed record. It frequently is difficult to reach an agreement on suitable operational definitions, and at times an operational definition distorts or even misses the concept it is trying to describe. For example, stress can also be defined as a subjective feeling of intense anxiety. The value of operational definitions lies in giving us a common ground of reference. The most important statements in science are based on scientific constructs. A scientist uses scientific constructs which are imaginary or hypothetical and cannot be seen with the naked eye or even with sophisticated optical equipment. In order to explain what we observe, the building blocks of nature, protons, neutrons, and electrons, remain visibly exclusive by direct observation, but are indirectly confirmed by their necessary there's a space in between necessary existence in the construct. Today's atomic model requires further inference to even smaller unseen particles such as quarks, leptons, and hadrons. The difficulty of not being directly observable does not imply non-existence. Rather, it has provided a continual progress towards an understanding of what may be real. Another familiar hypothetical construct is that of IQ, or the intelligence quotient. IQ is an imaginary construct that is used to explain certain behaviors, namely one's likelihood for academic success. Many of our concepts in science, almost all of the important ones, cannot be directly seen. We can know them only through their effects. Constructs such as a trait, reinforcement, and self have been created in efforts to understand personality scientifically. The concept of trait refers to a determining tendency or predisposition to respond in a certain way. Examples of traits are emotional stability, introversion versus extroversion. Allport, Cattell, Eysenck, and the theorists who identified the 5 primary personality factors, known as the Big Five, make extensive use of trait constructs in their theories. The self is another useful construct for understanding personality that is present in many contemporary theories. Carl Rogers' theory, self, refers to a psychological process that governs an individual's behavior. And Albert Bandura's theory, the self, is conceived more narrowly in terms of cognitive structures. Indeed, some personality theorists conceive the term personality itself as a scientific construct. Thus, Cattell, in 1950, defines personality as that which permits a prediction of what a person will do in a given situation. For Cattell, personality is an imaginary construct that permits us to explain and predict behavior. The scientific constructs of a personality theory tie together the true empirical findings of that theory and suggest new relationships that will hold true under certain conditions. Okay, criteria for evaluating scientific statements. As already pointed out, there is no one method of validating scientific statements. Personality theorists use a variety of techniques, some of which are very complicated to evaluate their work. We will be looking at a number of these later on in this chapter and in subsequent chapters when we discuss the specific assessment and research procedures used by different personality theorists. However, we can make some general comments about evaluating scientific statements. In order to qualify as scientific, statements must fulfill the criterion of verifiability. They must ultimately be based on empirical observation, and the theory behind them has to specify how they can be confirmed or refuted. Even throughout even though scientists may build elaborate theories referring to things that they cannot observe directly, the base of their theories on perceptions of human sense organs. They base their theories on the perceptions of human sense organs. It is true that I cannot test the statement John has an IQ of 110 in the same way I can test the statement there is a person in the room. I cannot simply look. The statement must be tested indirectly, but the test is still based on empirical observation, such as looking at John's performance on an IQ measurement device. Given the identical conditions, another person could be expected to share the same perceptions and draw the same conclusions. Scientific statements, therefore, are based on what is and what occurs in our everyday world as it appears to us through our sense organs. And second, scientific statements must be open to falsification. As a scientist, the personality theorist is required to indicate the conditions under which theoretical statements might be proven incorrect. If an exception is found to a scientific statement, that statement is considered to be false or in need of qualification. The generalization all aggressive people are controlling, for example, is disproven by pointing to an aggressive person who is not controlling, or qualified by indicating other conditions under which an aggressive person will not seek to control others. This helps us to understand why scientists never claim that the information produced by the scientific methods is ultimately true. Scientific hypotheses are tentative and need to be discarded when evidence contradicts them. Although scientific methods cannot be said to yield ultimate truth, they do provide a wealth of useful information to assist us in living in everyday world. It is our advantage, therefore, to act as if the conclusions of our scientific methods are true. Indeed, the final criterion for evaluating scientific constructs is that of usefulness rather than compellingness. Usefulness is the ability to generate information that can assist us in living. In the process of scientific investigations, the personality theorist frequently develops more than one hypothesis. Each one is examined and in turn to rule out those that do not stand up under test conditions. Occasionally, the scientist is left with a rival hypothesis. Given that both are sound hypotheses, how does the scientist decide between them? In general, 3 criteria have been used: compatibility, predictive power, and simplicity. Each of these criteria has advantages and limitations. Compatibility refers to the agreement of hypotheses with previously well-established information. This criterion is a sensible one since it is a lot easier for us to accept new hypotheses if it is consistent with the findings in other areas. However, it should not be too rigidly applied. There are times in science when a new idea completely shatters earlier theories, forcing us to revise and reconsider them. Predictive power refers to the range or scope of the statement. Scientists seek not to explain the phenomena that we observe, but also to predict and anticipate them. The more predictions or consequences that we can infer from a theory, the greater its range and usefulness in generating new ideas. On the other hand, too strict reliance on this criterion may lead to the notion that the only value of a theory lies in the amount of research and predictions it generates. Some theories express their heuristic value by integrating encompassing ideas rather than by generating specific predictions and research projects. And the third criterion for deciding between rival hypotheses is simplicity or parsimony. The preferred theory is the one that adequately accounts for the complexity of material in its simplest way. This criterion comes into play only when rival theorists that we will cover, such as Jung, Fromm, Horney, Rogers, Maslow, and May, however, have argued that the paradigm frequently fostered scientism, or the exclusive reliance on the narrow conception of science. which is inappropriate for understanding human nature. Some of these, most notably Young and Horney, have suggested that we turn to the East for a far more balanced comprehension. Where did it go? I think... Hypotheses generate identical consequences, which is a rare occurrence. We should note that in the West, theories of personality have often developed within the strict limits of the scientific paradigm. Oh, okay, so I've read the wrong part. Okay, so let me fix this. The third criterion, simplicity, right? Parsimony. The criterion comes into play only when rival hypotheses generate identical consequences, which is a rare occurrence. We should note that in the West, theories of personalities have often been developed within strict limits of a scientific paradigm. Some of the personality theorists that we will cover, such as Jung, Fromm, all those guys I already mentioned, however, have argued that the paradigm frequently fostered scientism or an exclusive reliance on the narrow conception of science, which is inappropriate for understanding human nature. Some of these, most notably Jung and Horney, have suggested that we should turn to the East for a more balanced comprehension. Okay, art of personality theories. If theories of personality have their own origin in philosophy and seek to validate their constructs through scientific methods, they can also culminate in some forms of art or practical application. Personality theories have found application in many ways, and the criteria for evaluating each way are varied. In this section, we introduce 3 applications of personality theories: assessment, research, and psychotherapy. Assessment. Assessment is a major area of application of personality theories to everyday life. Assessment refers to the evaluation or measurement. You have probably been touched by an assessment to a greater degree than you realize. In education, for example, assessment... Where's the rest? Okay, hold on. It dropped off for me. Got it. Assessment is used to measure progress and to evaluate learning disabilities. Psychologists in industries and organizations use assessment to assist in job placement. Prior to deciding on a course of counseling, a clinician needs to assess the individual in order to evaluate the nature of his or her problem. So what makes a good personality assessment? The most important criterion is validity. The quality of measuring what construct is supposed to measure is the most important thing. Wait, validity, the quality of measurement, what a construct is supposed to measure. Okay. This is often a difficult criterion to meet. For example, nearly all psychologists agree that certain intelligence tests are valid measures of predicting school performance. They are not at all, however, that these tests are valid measures of the exclusive quality of intelligence. In developing assessment techniques appropriate to their concepts, personality theorists need to show how the construct fits within the theory and also show that the assessment situation effectively measures it. A response false to the statement, "I like most people," is probably more indicative of hostility than the response true to the statement of "red is my favorite color." Reliability, or consistency of scoring over time, is also important, as a thermometer must register the same degrees each time for the same amount of heat in order to be consistent and useful measuring tool. The measurement of personality, however, is not that simple. The change in measurement may indicate not unreliable. A change in measurement may indicate not reliability of the measure, but growth or change in light of other events such as therapy. Objectivity. Objectivity, or the avoidance of subjective bias, is also prized in assessment. Objectivity is easier to obtain if responses are clearly delineated. In a true-false test, each response clearly indicates a certain factor. It is more difficult, but nevertheless possible, to develop objective criterion of scoring Protracted written or verbal responses. Such criterion provide objectivity in evaluating interviews, written essays, projective techniques, and so forth. Although it is very difficult to develop and evaluate appropriate assessment techniques, the wise and judicious use of assessment can be invaluable in developing individual and group potential. However, the scientific tools, assessment techniques must remain open to falsification, and our use of them needs to reflect that fact. The personality theorists discussed in this book have developed specific ways of assessing personality that are informed by and also inform their theories. These procedures range from the interpretation of dreams to statistically sophisticated and elaborately constructed tests. We will discuss each theorist's particular method. But first, some general words about two important approaches to assessing personality: psychometric tests and projective tests. Psychometric tests. Psychometric tests measure the personality characteristics by means of carefully designed questionnaire developed with theoretical and statistical techniques. Psychometric testing had its origin in the psychological laboratories established at the end of the 19th century. One of the most carefully researched questionnaires is the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. First published in 1942, the most recently revised in 1989. The MMPI is made up of over 550 self-report items or printed statements to which the participants answer true, false, or cannot say, designed to measure 10 tendencies towards pathology and abnormal behavior. The MMPI is employed as an aid in the diagnosis of psychiatric disorders and is widely used in personality research. Psychometric measuring devices and techniques have not been used without controversy. Many individuals view such tests as an invasion of personal privacy and are weary of the use of which tests results may be put. Yeah. Okay. Projective tests. Some psychologists, particularly in a clinical setting, also employ projective techniques. The participant is presented with a deliberately ambiguous stimulus. In response to the stimulus, the participant expresses personal attitudes, values, needs, and feelings. Two of the best-known projective techniques are the Rorschach inkblot test and the thematic apperception test, the TAT, which are derived, respectively, from the theories of Carl Jung and Henry Murray. The main advantage of projective techniques is that they disguise the purpose of the assessment. Because the stimuli are ambiguous, and the participant is free to respond in any way, it is difficult for the participant to know what would be an appropriate answer and to fake a correct response. The difficulty with projective tests is that they are very hard to score in an objective manner that avoids subjective bias and the projection of the scorer. Research. Personality theorists also differ widely on the type of research methods that they use. Some follow very strict scientific guidelines in their work. Here, the interface between science and application is very clear. Others encourage the use of a wider range of acceptable methodologies, making use of interdisciplinary and eclectic approaches. Indeed, restraints on creative and productive research may occur when the area of personality inquiry is too narrowly demarcated. Three research approaches commonly used by personality theorists are clinical approach, psychometric approach, and the experimental approach. It is difficult to be specific about evaluative criteria here because they vary according to specific activity and its canons of research. The clinical approach. Many of the personality theorists that we will consider originated in a clinical setting. The clinician conducts research through intensive interviews and observations of the participant. Clinical methods of research also include an analysis of dreams and early memories. The clinician The clinician may further structure the observations by asking questions or giving one or more tests. Frequently, there's considerable overlap between the theorists' methods of research and the methods of assessment. The primary tool in the clinical approach of personality is the development of a case history, a carefully drawn biography of an individual. Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalytic theory largely on the basis of case histories, including his own. Unlike most other research methods, the case history entails studying one individual or a small number of individuals in great depth rather than a large number of subjects. Freud and Erik Erikson also developed case studies about prominent historical figures such as Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Martin Luther, and Gandhi. The psychometric approach. The use of mathematical and statistical tools to measure personality characterizes the psychometric approach to research. Psychometrics has been facilitated by the growth of new and powerful mathematical technique for analyzing and synthesizing vast quantities of clinical data. The expansion has been accelerated by the ready availability of inexpensive computer software and software programs. The correlation is a major statistical tool used in psychometrics. In a correlational study, events or variables systematically observed as naturally occurring to see the extent to which they convey or occur together. Events that convey, Events that convey are said to be correlated. Correlations are expressed by a number that ranges between +1 to -1. The plus or minus sign tells us the relationship is either positive or negative. The numeric value tells us the extent of the relationship. The closer the numbers are to +1 or -1, the higher the frequency with which the two events occur or do not occur together. It is important to remember that a correlation does not imply that one variable caused the other. For example, there is a high correlation between brown hair and brown eyes. This is not to say that brown hair causes brown eyes, but rather that a great many people who have brown hair also have brown eyes. Nevertheless, when the two variables have a high correlation, it is reasonable to hypothesize that one caused the other, or a third variable caused both. However, such a hypothesis would have to be the subject of further testing. We are not permitted to draw conclusions simply based on a correlational study. Cattell and Eisnick made considerable use of the sophisticated correlational procedure called factor analysis in developing their theories. The experimental approach. Many psychologists favor the experimental approach because it permits them to infer a cause and effect relationship between two factors. In its simplest form, the researcher systematically varies the presence from one factor, the independent variable, while keeping all other variables consistent. The researcher can then determine whether or not the changes in the independent variable have had an effect on a particular behavior, the dependent variable. If they do, it is assumed that the changes in the independent variable cause the changes in the dependent variable. For example, if after students are provided with either positive or negative feedback following their performance on a memory test, they would be given a depression questionnaire to test for a change in mood. The two levels of feedback would serve as an independent variable, and their score on depression, based off of the score on the depression questionnaire, I need to take a break, would serve as a dependent variable. Experiments can be very complex with several independent and dependent variables. The experimental method is considered one of the most precise methods in psychological research. It has the advantage of permitting the experimenter to post a clear cause and effect relationship, but it has its limitations. To limit the findings of personality explorations to those who can be demonstrated only within the experimental laboratory would be to circumscribe the study of personality to merely those aspects about a person that can be studied by manipulation. Now, because of this constraint, many questions about the ultimate meanings, purposes, and goals of human living, questions that traditionally have been and concluded and could include the study of personality, would be ruled out of inquiry. A wider range of acceptable methodologies is necessary. Multiple approaches and methodologies are needed to understand the whole person. In general, the field of personality inquiry is broadening in scope. Since Sarbin in 1986 suggested that narrative might be considered a root metaphor for understanding human behavior and experience. The integrative life story has emerged as a significant vehicle for expressing the understanding of personality. Narrative thought has emerged as a primary form of cognition and self-understanding that qualitatively varies from abstract proportional or scientific thinking, and that further enables us to understand moral development. In general, the growing openness of personality theorists are far more effective methods contrasts with the perception by some other psychologists of a narrow view of science. Psychotherapy. The art of psychotherapy is the effort to apply the findings of personality theory in ways that will assist individuals and meet human goals. The word therapy comes from the Greek therapia, which means attending and healing. However, psychotherapists are not interested only in healing sick people. They are also interested in understanding normal people, learning how they function, and helping them to function more creatively. Although in many aspects psychotherapy is the flowering of personality theory, it is also the seed of it, because the desire to help people has fostered and nourished the development of personality theories. The two have gone hand in hand. Many theories of personality cannot be adequately understood without understanding the theory of psychotherapy that led to them. Okay, so goals of psychotherapy. Joseph Reichlach, 1968, points out that the psychotherapy has three major motives or goals: the scholarly, the ethical, and the curative. The scholarly motive considers therapy as a means of understanding the self and human nature. Psychoanalysis, for example, has been seen by Freud as a tool for discovering truths about human nature. His goal to help the individual acquire self-understanding and to develop comprehensive theory of human nature. He developed psychoanalysis as a method of research aimed at these ends. The ethical motive considers therapy as a means of helping the individual to change, improve, grow, and better the quality of life. Carl Rogers' work is an example of the ethical motive. His emphasis is on a climate created by the therapist that permits change to occur within the client rather than on cognitive understanding or the manipulation of behavior. The curative motive aims directly at eliminating troublesome symptoms and substituting more suitable behaviors. Most behavior theorists, for example, consider that they have been hired to do a job and seek to do it as effectively and quickly as possible. From this point of view, the therapist is responsible for creating changes, removing symptoms, and controlling behavior. Most people enter therapy with the expectation that they will be cured or helped to improve. In this respect, the curative motive is most consistent with the popular view of psychotherapy. Because of this expectation, many people have difficulty, particularly at the beginning, in undergoing psychoanalysis or other forms of insight therapy. If they stay with it, however, their reasons for being in therapy change, and they begin to appreciate the value of other motives. Obviously, the reasons for entering, continuing in, and practicing psychotherapy are mainly and mixed. This is why the evaluation of therapy is a difficult issue. So, evaluating psychotherapy. How does one go about evaluating psychotherapy? What criteria are appropriate? And in 1952, Hans Eisnick stunned the therapeutic community with the report on treatment outcomes, indicating that various forms of psychotherapy are no more effective than providing a placebo or merely waiting for the condition to get better on its own. Eisnick's report created a flurry of research and comment, as meta-analyses of psychotherapy outcome studies were conducted showing that various forms of psychotherapy are consistently beneficial. Eisnick's criterion for improved focus on symptom remission. Eisnick continued to reaffirm his position, but acknowledged that the problem is a paradigm conflict in which different criteria are used. Eisnick was an advocate of the behaviorist position. Differences in the theory led to differences in therapy. Symptom remission may be an appropriate criterion for therapies governed by the curative motive, but not necessarily for those that are conducted for other purposes. So if the proportion of cures were the only criterion by which psychotherapies were to be judged, psychoanalysis and other insight therapies would have long since disappeared from the scene with the arrival of more efficient and less costly curative techniques. A meta-analysis is a comprehensive analysis of several studies. Just little asterisks there. This, however, has been the case. If one's criterion rests on scholarly grounds, psychoanalysis emerges a clear winner. No other method of therapy has provided us with such a wealth of information about the complexity and depth of human personality. In brief, each method of psychotherapy must be evaluated in terms of its own goals and purposes. Behavior therapists who claim at curing clients are particularly interested in discovering the proportion of cures associated with various techniques. Ethical theorists who aim at creating a suitable climate for therapeutic change and life improvement have stimulated the study of those conditions that foster personality change and their effects. Freudian psychoanalysis asks to be evaluated in terms of its effectiveness as a method of research aimed at understanding human nature. Meta-analyses of the efficacy of psychotherapy continue to support the effectiveness of psychodynamic and other therapies, while also continuing the discussion of appropriate evaluation for psychotherapy. Figure 1.3 summarizes the evaluation of psychotherapy and the other main points of the chapter. So, challenges of evaluation. I've suggested that personality theorists may function as philosophers, scientists, and artists. The use of this threefold approach allows us to recognize each activity as it arises and gives us a better idea of how personality theories in general and specific personality theories work. It is also important to identify different hats of philosophy, science, and/or art that personality theorists are wearing as they make their statements, because each activity has its own rules and procedures for establishing information, and each has its own criteria for judging the worth of its findings. No theory is simply philosophy, science, or art. Every theory combines elements of all three. Nor are we trying to establish a model that all personality theories must follow. The fact is that there is no one scientific method, philosophical approach, or psychotherapeutic strategy that would serve as an adequate model for all others. Scientific studies of personality rely on paradigms that can be established only philosophically and that generally culminate in some form of art or practical application. The desire to be scientific reflects itself in an effort to test constructs by validating evidence rather than by relying on gut-level feelings of illumination that everyday language calls understanding something. Some psychologists have attempted to narrow the possible activity of a personality theorist to one function or interpretation of science, such as an objective experimental methodology, and have ignored the philosophical assumptions on which all scientific work is based. Others have assumed that the compelling character of philosophical assumptions is sufficient to establish their credibility as scientific findings about personality. Either position is unnecessarily limiting. It is important that we distinguish among the different kinds of functions that personality theories entail so that we can recognize them and evaluate them accordingly. Part of the current problem in personality theorizing is that theorists are not always clear about what hat they're wearing or what activity they're engaged in. As we discuss the major personality theorists in the following chapters, we will try to clarify the function of philosophy, science, and art in each theory. This should enable you to see how the theories fit into an overall framework of personality theories as philosophy, science, and art. As you will see, there is a wide variety of diversity of personality theories, providing you with a rich selection from which to choose or develop your own theory of personality. All right. There's a table, but it's not on mine. Summary. All right, let's see. Oh, okay. Okay. Summary. Like, where are we? Okay, summary. The term personality, page 2, is difficult to define because there is little common agreement on how the term should be used. In everyday speech, it refers to someone's public image. Different personality theorists present their own definitions of the world based on their theoretical positions. 2. The theory, page 2, is a set of abstract concepts that we make about a group of facts or events in order to explain them. 3. Two traditions inform contemporary theories of personality. One stems from psychological laboratories and academic research. The other stems from psychoanalysis and clinical psychology. The study of personality became a formal and systematic area of specialization in American psychology in the mid-1930s. But the two traditions have never fully merged. 4. Personality theories may function as a philosophy, science, and art. As scientists, personality theorists developed hypotheses that help us to understand human behavior. As philosophers, they explore what it means to be a person. And as artists, they seek to apply what is known about human behavior to make a better life. 5. Some of the basic philosophical issues on which personality theorists differ are freedom versus determination, page 8, heredity versus environment, page 8, these are all page 8, okay? Uniqueness versus universality, proactivity versus reactivity, and optimism versus pessimism. 6. Philosophical assumptions from page 6 suggest that things are not necessarily what they appear to be. They're based on a specific epiphantic vision. Oh, that's what that word was. It was in a funky font and I couldn't read it. There it is. Epiphantic vision, which goes beyond the ordinary perception of our sense organs. Philosophical statements tend to be global and do not allow for any expectations. They often are implicit rather than explicit. Number 7, philosophical assumptions are evaluated by criteria appropriate to the special act of knowing that underlies them. The criteria are coherence, relevance, comprehensiveness, all of which add up to a final criterion of compellingness, page 9 and 10. Number 8, science has its basis in philosophy, from page 6. Because the ordinary observation on which science relies depends on a prior paradigm. Page 12. MAT is a paradigm. MAT is established philosophically. The values and standards of science also function as philosophical commitments. Number 9. The simplest kinds of scientific statements, this is page 12, are empirical, based directly on observation. The data on which these statements are based may be objective, page 12, or subjective, also page 12. When a number of different observations coincide, the scientists may make generalizations. Scientists also use operational definitions which specify the behaviors included in the term, and scientific constructs, these are from page 13, which uses imaginary and hypothetical concepts to explain what we observe. And number 10, scientists use a variety of techniques to evaluate their work. All of these techniques are ultimately verifiable from page 14. That is, based on observation, the ordinary preconceptions of our sense organs, although some statements can be tested only indirectly, scientific statements must be open to falsification. The scientist must indicate the conditions under which the statement might be proven false. Scientists do not claim that the information produced by their methods is ultimately true. Scientific statements should be judged for their usefulness, from page 15, rather than their truth. When scientists end up with more than one hypothesis, the criteria they use decides between rival hypotheses are compatibility, predictive power, and simplicity, from page 15. Personality theories have found application in assessment and research. Two major approaches to assessing personality are psychometric and projective techniques. Three primary research approaches used in personality are the clinical approach, the psychometric approach, and the experimental approach. You can find those on page 18 and 19. Number 12, the three major goals of psychotherapy are scholarly, ethical, and curative motives. Scholarly therapies should be evaluated on the basis of their contributions to the understanding of the self and human nature. Ethical therapies should be evaluated in terms of suitability of the climate that they create for fostering change and life improvement. Curative therapies should be evaluated on the basis of symptom remission and a number of cures. Number 13. It is important to distinguish among the different orientations of personality theories so that they can recognize each viewpoint and use appropriate methods to evaluate each theory. We have a couple of exercises here. Personal experiences. Number 1. You use theories in your personal life all the time. Theories about the fastest way to get home to the mall, theories about how to attract and keep a boyfriend or girlfriend, theories about how to get what you want from your parents, theories about how to get an A in this class. Each theory needs evidence to support and legitimize it. Discuss a theory you've come up with in the past year or so, perhaps a theory about love or a theory about how to achieve success after college. What prompted you to come up with this theory, and how have you been testing it? What kinds of evidence have you used, and how is your theory holding up? Number 2. To better understand theories that you develop in your own life, you need a better understanding of your own philosophical assumptions. Review Table 1.1 and recall where you fell on the scale of each criteria. Having evaluated your philosophical assumptions, try to determine how they may have impacted the theory you discussed in question 1. And number 3. Although this text exclusively focuses on theories as they pertain to personality, many of the same principles of evaluation and assessment hold true for all theories. Looking at the thinking critical box, evaluating personality theories, and use the assessment list provided to evaluate your theory on question 1. How is your theory measuring up? Is it more of a philosophy or a scientific statement? Is there any tweaking you could do to your theory to make it fit into one category or another? Those are just kind of food for thought, I guess. And coming up next will be chapter 2.